Welcome, Filming Italy Los Angeles, 6th edition. I'm very honored to have here for the presentation of his last book, Oliver Stone, For Chasing the Light. Thank you, Oliver, to be here. And we are connected with all the students. I would love to thank you, all the university that are connected with us today. And I give you to Nick just to start the conversation.
Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you, Tiziana. Welcome, Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone needs no introduction. He's a three-time Oscar-winning writer-director who just published his coming-of-age memoir, Chasing the Light, writing, directing, and surviving Platoon, Midnight Express, Scarface, Salvador, and The Movie Game. That is the part that the book goes to. It goes up to Platoon. Subsequently, Stone went on to become one of the seminal directors of his era with films like JFK, Wall Street, U-Turn, Born on the 4th of July, Nixon, W, Natural Born Killers, World Trade Center, Any Given Sunday, Alexandra, and many other films and documentaries. We are having this conversation for film students, and I consider myself one of them. I'm a film reporter. I'm not a film critic. First off, Oliver, you chose a really great title for the book. It's a really, it works on a lot of levels, Chasing the Light. And for me, perhaps the biggest takeaway, to put it simply, is what emerged from the book is the really strong connection between your personal life and your films, both the ones that you wrote and the ones that you wrote and also directed. And one of the things that sort of stands out for me in reading about the initial part of your career is that unlike the sort of auteurs that Italian film students are probably more familiar with, like, for example, Fellini, Antonioni. In looking at your career, there's always been a very strong sense of the power of storytelling and of connecting with the storytelling to the audience. And also, there's always been, I think, a passion for genre filmmaking, and even for Hollywood in a way. And so I think what's interesting is the personal connection, but also the way that you've always wanted to connect with audiences, essentially. At least that's my impression. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I would like to start out with that. Personal and genre, and also being aware of the audience.
Well, well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Tiziana, for having me, and thank you, Nick, for doing this. So it's hard to communicate to 2,000 people, but when you're in a Zoom call, but I'm going to try to do the best I can and talk to myself a bit. I've always been a writer. My father taught me how. I showed in the book I wrote, I talked about the early roots of screenwriting in my father's world, who is a writer, and I talk about the differences between my parents, of course, which is a big thing. In a sense, I say later in the book, my mother was a director and my father was a writer, which I think is true. And I think I blended gradually these two people. It took a long time of development to bring these two people into some kind of harmony where I could function. The personal comes from writing. See, I wrote a book when I was 19 years old. It was called The Child's Night Dream. And it was a big decision in my life because the book was turned down. And of course, I poured my heart into it. And when it was rejected, it broke me. It ended my desire to ever write a book again. And I went off and joined the Army and went to Vietnam. So that played a significant role. When I came back from the war, I decided I was at a dead end for a while, and after about a year, I went back to I went to film school because it was a GI Bill that was paying for it, and because, frankly, it seemed like a fun idea. I'd always liked movies, but I never considered them as a possible occupation. In film school, I became enamored of the idea of actually using this new medium to express myself. So it became this combination of the writing that had always existed there and developing that as a screenwriter, which took time too. Going to classes, working with people who were screenwriters, the influence of Robert Bolt. There was a lot of things that it took many years for me to be accepted as a screenwriter. It took about 7 years, and there was a lot of scripts. But that's where the marriage came from. But I never wanted just to be a writer in the movie business because I knew how badly treated they were. So my goal was always from NYU on was to be a writer director, and to keep it personal. That's certainly a big factor, and we can talk about that. But I wanted to say the reason I wrote the book partly is to get to younger people because, as you said, the book ends in 1986 with Platoon. So it's the early part of my career, but it's a very important part of my career because in that section of the book is where I laid the foundation for my character and for my writing and directing. And laying that foundation takes time. And I wanted to reach out to younger people who were also interested in doing this and told them about the experience I had and the path I took, thinking that it might be helpful to them too, to read a book like this, because I haven't read a book quite like this. I've read a lot of biographies, but the early days are sometimes the most important.
Well, the book is so fascinating on so many different levels because, as you say, I think it's an essential reading for any film student in terms of just the formation of a director. But of course, there's also a lot of history there, and I think anyone who has any interest in what was going on in America in the 70s and 80s, and the new Hollywood and all of that, and the industry as well, the inner workings of the industry. I mean, there's just so much. There's so much there, and it's so vivid as well. It's so vividly told. But one of the things that I think could be useful to students, to film students, is the fact that while you were at NYU, while you were attending film school there, you also took a course in Greek myths, which was outside of the film school curriculum. And you mentioned how that was an important experience for you, just in terms of sort of your formation as a writer, as a screenwriter. And I think that could be interesting for the students as well.
Yeah, it was important. That's why I put it in, because all the film students, very few of them were interested in writing. It was interesting. There was a screenwriting courses, and they were good teachers, but they were empty, 5 people, 6 people. It wasn't mandatory to take a screenwriting course, which I think is a crime, because at that time in the 1970s, with the new French New Wave and the Italian, so forth, people looked at the auteur, the director, as the man who walks out on the set and improvises and makes the great film like Godard or Fellini. But that's not often the case. And I go into that argument of screenwriter, director, and the importance of screenwriters. It's overlooked. I worked with traditional screenwriter like Robert Bolt, and I was mentored by him. And he puts everything on the page. Now that's very hard to do, but it's a real challenge. But some of the other people I've met, and they're not so formal. They don't put it all on the page. So there's different ways, there's different approaches to writing screenplays. And that's fascinating to study screenplays. But when I got into that, the Greek myth idea is very important because it woke me up. I was always interested in history and in Greeks and Romans. I always loved history. And here was a chance to take a free course, an elective course, and I decided to go over and take the Greek mythology class with Tim Leahy, who was a terrific professor, very vehement. Young, he was in his 40s then, and he knew the Greek story in and out, and the Homer and all the stories of the classical, the structures of Greek myth. And he told us one day, just among many things, he said, look, why is Odysseus So why does Odysseus come back from the wars? He's one of the few people who ever makes it back. Why is he alive and return? It takes him a long time. It takes him years to get back to home. And he says, he wrote on the blackboard, consciousness, the power of consciousness. And that is the difference between him and the men who did not come back. And he gave us all the specific examples because, and the students were not really paying close attention. And he wrote on the board, why? Because the people who didn't come back were under the power of lethe, L-E-T-H-E, and he said, sleep, they're asleep. And I realized that most of us students at that time were asleep. We didn't realize the importance of being alive, being conscious. And the Greeks, I think the Greeks, especially Odysseus, in his wiliness and his ability to survive many adversities, is a great example of how to remain conscious in this world and navigate your way through it. So I took that to heart. And I think out of that came my desire to write a screenplay about my own experience in Vietnam, which I considered to have been like the Trojan War for Homer, which is to say a long period of futility. I was there for more than a year, and needless violence and death, and horrible things happened. But at the same time, I wasn't really conscious as a young man of what I had done over there. So becoming more conscious of that war and its meanings is what happened from that point on. And that's when I wrote Platoon in 1976, a few years after this incident in film school. And I took as a basis of the Platoon movie, if you remember correctly, the idea of two sergeants who are at war with each other, and there's a third, the witness, the third party is the young man who goes to the war and sees in these two sergeants two polar opposites of the American experience. And from that, he becomes the son of, as I said at the end of the movie, the son of two fathers. You have to understand the movie to understand that there's more significance in the Vietnam War than we don't just go there and pass through and walk out. No, war is a very defining experience and it changes your life. So by acknowledging this and by deepening it and by bringing it out into a screenplay form, it really helped me deal with the war on another level.
Well, yeah, I think Platoon is so wonderful in that way. I think, and having now read the book and I saw the film again, it just made me realize the beauty of the transformation of a personal experience into something that, of course, has it has elements that are different from the experience that you had, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful to study that, to see how something that you lived, that you experienced so deeply, was then sort of elaborated and worked through narratively to get to the point where it became this amazing film that is considered rightly, I think, so true to the real experience of having actually, been there. Vis-a-vis other Vietnam films, I think it's the one that really, has that flavor to it.
Different.
Let's say. Yes.
It's very different. It's very strong anti-Vietnam position, which people sometimes don't understand. They say, oh, if you remember, one of the key incidents is one of the sergeants kills the other sergeant. This is a big thing, a huge thing, and it's sort of like a civil war going on inside the American experience, and that's what I was dealing with. And few people have ever raised that. Few people have raised that in movies or books, for that matter. And I think it goes to a core part of the American experience there in Vietnam, which I talk about in an even larger framework. Because I come back from the war, I'm not as conscious as I became. And it took me many years to learn, but also it's the experience of the war and what America was doing in foreign countries, going to these wars, these forever wars since then, and the futility of it. It was like as bad as the Greeks going to Troy. I I was addressing myself to a larger framework, which is to say, my government, what it's doing in these countries, which led to further experiences in my life and led me to a rather rich career in finding an enemy, so to speak, somebody who I had to, that was the US government became a foil against which I could measure myself. And I suppose it led to, much criticism. People hated me, and they led to a lot of issues because there was other films to come. But I didn't know that at the time. But these are the foundations of what happened before I became JFK or I did Snowden or any of those other movies, Born on the 4th of July. This is the foundation.
Well, we're looking forward to the sequel. But I'm now going to go into the questions that were sent to us from the film students, starting from the Scuola d'Arte Cinematografica Florestano Vancini of Ferrara. And one of the questions that came from there, which goes back to something that we touched on earlier, it's a very simple question, but it has to do with writing and directing, which is, what is the most important part of a story, and what comes first, the visual or the narrative? That's the question.
Well, ideally, you get both. There's no, don't pick one over the other. Tell the best damn story you can, and tell it in the most, in the manner in which you think it will be originally accepted. You have to be, you have to realize that there's been perhaps your movie or story has already been done 50 times. It's not a problem if you find a way to tell a story in an original way. And that means camera angles, actors, script, dialogue. There's so many different ways you can hit different notes. But find a theme if you can. Find a theme. One point I didn't make on the previous answer is my theme in Vietnam became clearer and clearer to me. And what was it? If you look at the movie, it's the lies that we told to ourselves and the lies the government told to us in that period of time. These lies, the concept of lying, permeates my book. And I tie it back to the divorce of my parents. I also tie it back eventually to the Kennedy killing, which occurred right before Vietnam in 1963. And my parents had this elemental divorce in 1962. So all my formative years were shaped by discoveries of lies, white lies, black lies, whatever you want to call them. Vietnam was the worst lie of all because it was the biggest lie. The American government was saying, we are winning this war, don't worry, and give us your sons and we will win, and communism will be conquered, which was the biggest lie and the delusion of all of them. But there are other lies in Vietnam, which I go into in the book.
Absolutely.
So I had a theme, you understand? I was working around anger, a theme of exposure, at the same time, keeping in mind what I had experienced just as an infantryman, not to go into the officer class, not to go higher, stay in the jungle, stay with that platoon.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's, yeah, the platoon is key, and the personal connection, of course. Now, the other question that comes from the Scuola d'Arte Cinematografica Florestano Vancini of Ferrara is pertaining to a screenplay that you wrote, which in some way you had a personal connection to, which in a very different way. And the question is, Mr. Stone, you have made a name for yourself in Hollywood as a screenwriter. What was the reason that prompted you? Oh, I'm sorry. No. This is not the question. No. The question is pertaining to Scarface, okay? And the question is, how did you, I wonder how long it took you to write, okay? This is the question that they sent. The whole Scarface masterpiece. Okay, so if you could talk to us a little bit about I believe that Scarface is a movie that you were asked to write, it was a remake of a previous film, but there was a personal connection to it, and the preparation for that screenplay was very interesting.
Yeah, it's in the book in detail. It certainly was a big project, and it was a challenge from beginning to end. I had my connection to it was drugs, because we were taking the old movie and making it about drugs, and I was passionate about the concept of the drug war. I thought it was a ridiculous idea to begin with, and I saw the government, Nixon, in 1969, they started to declare the war on drugs, and they've made casualties of many, many people who didn't deserve it. It really cut into our country is in love with the idea of war. They always declare war on poverty, war on drugs, war on Vietnam, war in Iraq. I mean, wars are very popular here. You have to understand the American mentality. I don't, in the sense of I don't accept it. And I was passionate about this, but at the same time, I was doing a gangster film for people who did not have these points of view. So I was learning the ropes and learning to, modify my own personal feelings and adapting them to the needs of what they wanted, which was a commercial movie about a gangster. And they wanted it to be big and colorful, and just as the original was. But except that we're doing it in modern day Miami, and we're doing it about Cubans, Marielitos, they called them. And I took the license and I ran with it. I did a lot of research down there. I already knew a lot about, I knew about drugs already, but I'd been in jail already, but I went to South America and the Caribbean, and hung out with as many people as I could learn from. I talked with all the legal authorities in Florida, and I had fun with it because it was a time when the cocaine trade was just about to boom. 1980, from 1981 on, 81 on, it was a huge business, a huge volume. No one had any idea of how huge. And even then, I was taking you can see in the movie the anti-drug story. You can see the story about how we're hypocrites. People are making money on both sides of the fence. The government's making money from chasing the drugs, forming new departments, new bureaucrats, whole new divisions of the US government, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is a joke, and interfering in other countries. So at the same time, it's a wonderfully passionate story about a young man who's chasing the gold and the girls, and he finds the American dream in a strange way. Of course, he becomes super rich, super ruthless, and at the end of the day, super pathetic in the sense that he loses his mind to cocaine.
Well, it's wonderful because, within the genre structure of the film, there's also a political statement, and it works at so many different levels. And by the way, that question came from the Lewis Business School in Rome. Okay, we now have a question from the Università di Cagliari in Sardinia, and I'm afraid that we're kind of jumping around here a little bit, sort of thematically, but the question has to do with your sort of reputation, let's say, as a provocateur. Okay, and the question is, does politically correct, okay, in any way influence your way of working? Have you ever been afraid to end up in the politically incorrect without realizing it? Have you ever suffered a form of censorship? This is part of the question, even before the tendency to politically correct.
Yes, of course I have. I suppose in many ways I'm one of the most incorrect people in Hollywood. I never fit in, and even although I got some Oscars early in my career, I don't think they knew what they were doing. My view of Vietnam was way beyond what most people felt. They all thought it was a bad war, but they weren't thinking about the bigger picture. When I moved on to Midnight Express, even I I'm at a speech early in 1979 at the Golden Globes. I talk about it in the book. I offended many people by defending marijuana usage at an award ceremony, and I got into a lot of hot water, and it kept going. But in the late 70s, early 80s, I think Hollywood was a little more liberal, certainly was. And by the 90s, when the corporations got bigger and the money got bigger and everything got bigger, it became more uptight. And by the 2001 period, when the 2001, when the war on terror was declared, it was very difficult to criticize the American foreign policy, although it deserved to be criticized. Very difficult. And films such as mine, and I made a few in that period, were regarded as dangerous, as stupid, as against what people wanted, which was they wanted a sense of control over the world, and they accepted it. America had the right to go into any country and kill anybody and bring order, a sense of democracy to these countries. I didn't buy that. I never did. So I've crossed the line many times now. I criticized the Israeli position in 2003. I forgot how many times I crossed the line. I took a lot of heat there and so forth. It just constantly not paying attention to what's right, what's supposed to be right. Of course, once you get into all these new movements, you know, I've offended too many people. I can't tell you. I just say I've muzzled my mouth to some degree because who needs to get more and more abuse? I think I'm becoming older, and I'm tired of abuse, and it's hurt my career to some degree, especially when I did the Putin interviews, stuff like that. Which is, I think, a very important piece of work, which allows us to meet with the president who we hate, we supposedly hate, and we constantly accuse him of things. But here is a chance to actually hear him speak in his own words. That kind of thinking, my documentaries on Castro, Chavez, Putin were badly received in this country, better in Italy, but badly received in this country. In fact, Italy has been very open to thinking freely.
Sort of segueing from that, I have a question from the Accademia Nazionale di Cinema in Bologna. And the question is, many protagonists of your scripts are real people whose life has been marked by very delicate events. Ron Kovic, Billy Hayes, Edward Snowden. And the question is, what kind of preparation is necessary? What kind of preparatory work is necessary to create these characters?
Well, you're talking about two scripts that took an enormous amount of research. I remember how painful it was. In fact, Born on the 4th of July was written in 1977-8, and 10 years before it was made in 1989. And it was, I got to know Ron Kovic very well, and I got to know through him a world I didn't know about of the wounded in California. Went to many hospitals, talked to many veterans, learned a certain compassion that I had never developed until I worked with Ron. And of course, his story is very emotional, passionate, and I was criticized for that because it is a passionate movie and it's told through his point of view. But it took a lot of research and getting to know Ron. And then it wasn't made for 10 years. That was another upsetting factor. That was really upsetting. Finally got made, and it actually won an Oscar for me. But, you know, I'm sorry that it didn't. Anyway, I'm sorry that it didn't. It's hard still to accept that film for the Americans. I can tell you that. I know that. It's a wonderful film about a certain period in our life. But people don't want to see a man who's been castrated in a wheelchair. I see that resistance. Although it's a beautiful movie, once you watch it, you understand, you become aware of the compassion necessary. But it's very hard for people to watch. I could tell when the Tom Cruise fans, all those young people, a lot of them did not want to see that movie because he was in a wheelchair. And a lot of the girls who loved him as a young man, you know, were turned off by the idea. So you run into these personal issues. Same thing is true of Snowden. I mean, I spent with my co-writer, Kieran Fitzgerald, I spent 2 years working on that script. Too much, I think, sometimes, too much. We wanted to know the truth, so we went to Moscow. We spoke to Snowden many times, and in the end, the movie is his reflection of his own life. It's the way he sees his actions. I believe him, but some people won't, and they'll think he's whatever he is. They'll think he's a traitor. But it is Snowden's point of view of all these events, and it's very authentic in that way, very authentic, and that takes time. So in those two cases, you hit on two hardball cases for me. I don't know if I'd want to return there. Snowden was not as well received because America was never accepted him the same way as, for example, Italy and France and Germany liked him much more. And the film was lukewarm reception in the United States.
I think it's very interesting how you've worked with real characters and been true to them, but you've also in some cases had sort of taken some creative liberties with reality in a way, and I think it would be interesting for the students to know whether there's a certain criteria that you've adopted in doing that, whether it was dictated by narrative needs or whether there were other aspects. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Platoon. I mean, Platoon, you made the decision to have, the two sergeants actually, one of the two kill the other one, for example. But there are a lot of instances, I think, in which you've taken reality and in some cases been very rigorous in representing it, and others in which instead you have taken a bit more liberties, I think.
Yeah, and I think certainly that's a discussable point, because sometimes you go too far in trying to be accurate and it becomes dull. So I think you need. I've approached it as a dramatist, and sometimes as a dramatist, you have to be like take the approach of a Shakespeare, which is to make it move, but at the same time keep to the spirit of the truth as you have found out through research. Now, the spirit of the truth is important. You may not know the truth, but you think you know the truth by doing the research. That's why research is crucial. For example, in the JFK case, we did tons of research, and we raised all these questions because they're valid questions that had come up from other researchers who'd been working on this case for 20, 30 years. And we brought it all into a dramatic form, those we believed. There were many researchers whose work we did not include because we did not believe them. So we did the research, took the best of it, and in that spirit created a 3-hour, 8-minute movie in which we had to combine characters. And of course, I got tremendous criticism for it, but the combination of 5 or 6 characters into one character for the purposes of drama is certainly allowable, as long as you don't violate the truth of it. If 5 people agree and they're pretty much saying the same thing, you can combine them. If 5 people don't agree, it would be wrong to make them into one person.
Sure.
This is going on all the time. The 2 sergeants in Platoon, they existed, as I said in the book, in different platoons. I knew them separately, but because they represented something so extreme to me, I was, in my imagination, I put them in the same platoon for the purposes of drama and made the point that I wanted to make, that one man would kill the other because there's a very good reason why he kills him in the movie. If you remember, there was a war crime in a village and one sergeant reports the other sergeant. He does the right thing. And the sergeant who's been accused kills the other man eventually because he wants to cover up the crime, and his career is at stake. There's a lot of good reasons for killing him. And what happens is the young man then takes it upon himself to revenge the sergeant. I didn't do that, but it certainly is the spirit of what many people, I think, felt in Vietnam, that this is what we should have done.
And it provides a very powerful cinematic moment. I mean, it really does.
But most history is distorted. Most history in movies is distorted. And but often in a bad way, because they want to make for example, a Black Hawk Down or whatever, that wonderful movie. It was beautifully made by Ridley Scott, but it distorts what America was doing on the ground there in Somalia and makes heroes of people who are not heroes. This happens again and again in American movies. In Iraq, it's happened, Afghanistan, the Mark Wahlberg stuff. They make heroes for movie purposes. That's not what I do. If you look very closely, I have very few heroes. And the heroes I choose to have are, generally speaking, because they have a conscience and they have to fight for it.
Well, that's fascinating. And the book also mentions your relationship with Ridley Scott. So I think that's interesting as well. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the way narrative is changing for the screen at the moment. Okay, which basically has to do with television, with what we used to call television, which is now sort of streaming and platforms. But the basic thing is what you're seeing a lot more of now are long form narratives, okay, and as a writer director, of course, but I'm curious about how you feel about that, about whether it's a form that my impression is you haven't actually really delved into it, whether it's something that you're interested in doing, the decompression, the having, being able to have the story breathe out more, whether this is something that you're attracted to.
Yes, I think it's possible. It depends on my energy level, but there's great stories out there, and you can tell a story, and obviously you have 4, 5, 6 hours to tell a story that is worth that amount of time. The problem is, I find on a lot of television, not all of it, a lot of padding. In other words, you feel that they're drawing it out for commercial purposes to draw you into a season, and you'll watch 10 hours when in fact the story could be told in 6 hours. Coming from where I do, from making movies all my life, it was always the idea was to get the story down to less than 3 hours. And sometimes I got criticized for making it more. My Nixon movie, my JFK movie, my Alexander movie were, if those who hated it certainly made a point about its length, but sometimes the story has to be that long. For example, the second version of Alexander, the one I like, which is the third version, the final cut, goes 2 hours and 35 minutes, 3 hours and 35 minutes, and the original version was 2 hours and 56 minutes. So I couldn't tell the story in less than 3 hours, but that was a contractual point that Warner Brothers enforced on me. So there's always reasons like that, but I don't like padding either. I tell the story as quickly as you can, as effectively as you can. But I would do television because there's a lot of good stuff that can be told in 6 hours, or even if you really need it, 8 to 10 hours. A lot of good stuff, and I've enjoyed many shows. So I have nothing against television because that's where we're going anyway with streamers. You can call it television. It's basically home screens, and it depends how good your home screen is. Certainly, I like many aspects of it because in the old days on film, I used to suffer because I'd go to as many theaters as I could and watch the projectors, because the projectionist would sometimes, people don't realize that the projectionist in the old days controlled the movie business. They had the biggest labor contracts. The unions were strongest in the projection booth. Unionists, you never could get rid of them. So there was a lot of abuse as a result, and a lot of films were badly projected, without maintenance, without care. And if you're a director, man, you really sweat that because you want to make good prints. You want them to be out there. You want people to be in focus. I would go through so many battles with laboratories and theaters. You can't believe what goes on behind the scenes just to get a good showing. So in a way, when we went to digital, it became so much easier. You didn't have to supervise the prints to the degree that you have. You would make a standard, a master, and the master would be in Blu-ray or whatever form or high def, and then eventually to 4K, 8K. It's solved. You have one standard print and it's pretty good. So that makes me happy, and that's what you see on your home screen.
Now,
So that's one argument for actually. There's no I have no problem with it. The problem is finding the right story. And when I've done 20 movies and 8, 9 documentaries. So frankly, is it worth my telling the story, another story that's somewhat like what I've done? That comes up a lot. And there are certain things, certain forms I would like to do, but I haven't been able to get them financed. I've had several movies that were not financed, and I spent a lot of time developing them. That happens, I accept that, it's a very competitive business, and I admire many of the TV stuff, much of the home screen stuff I'm seeing. I mean, this year alone in the movies, there was many good films, rich films.
well, I think probably, in my opinion, the book, Chasing the Light, could be a great basis for a long form narrative. Frankly, that's just my opinion. I have one more question from the students from the Scuola Mohol in Milan, and it has to do with the new kind of the new environment, the new landscape in which new directors, young directors today are making their debuts. And the question is, what choices would you make if you were to make your debut as a director in the current film industry? And how should we make our first moves as film students? And I think there's a lot to learn by reading your book. I mean, that's something that I would suggest to the students. But the book pertains to a different environment, and in the current industry, what would your advice be?
I think the same rules apply. Story, story, story. And I would look for your story and your theme first before you get into the whole paraphernalia of, I got to make a movie. I got to make a movie. And then you're so eager sometimes to make the movie that you stumble into it. The problem, in a sense, is that now, because of the technology, has become much lighter, much cheaper. You can turn out a film on an iPhone. We couldn't do that in the old days. We didn't even have video. We went right from the lab film, and it was more expensive and more difficult and unwieldy. To make a film in those days was hard. And to get a low budget film made was a real journey. It was like you had to be audacious coming back from Troy. I made Seizure when I was right out of film school, when I was about 26. Seizure was an odyssey for me, and I talk about it in the book a bit. I obviously have many more stories. And then I made The Hand. I mean, the Seizure is really the low budget thing I'm talking about. And Salvador in the book too, which becomes a chase after this very large story, huge story, the Civil War in Salvador. No one was covering it. And that is the kind of story I was attracted to because it was different. It was original. Salvador in 1980, what the hell? In 1985, that was, you didn't do that. You didn't do that. So I broke my balls for years trying to make it, and I got it made finally, and it really worked. It worked. But I would say to the young film student, find yourself a smaller theme if possible, a smaller theme. Keep it personal if you can. Make your movie at any price you can. Get as much as you can, but if you don't have cooperation and you have to make the movie on an iPhone, get it made. Make it so good that people will notice. The danger, of course, is the opposite, is that you have so many movies being made that it's very difficult to be singled out, to be noticed. So it becomes a problem of publicity and distribution, which is crucial. And I think most films are dying on the vine. They don't get distributed. They don't get distributed. And that's a shame, but so you have to make your movie to stand out. You must make that, but at least you have the chance to make it. I know
Well, yeah,
many young film students.
the technology these days is more in favor of the director, certainly, and I think it's really interesting that at the same time, you know, the sort of the key to being able to emerge is the same is what you're saying. It's story, 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 and it's, I think, passion also, and just, you know, what I got out of the book was just this passion that, you know, that drove you constantly, you know, and the ups and downs and the roller coaster and the having, you know, the hustle and but just you know, just the being so driven, and I think that's something that, you know, is gonna remain as the kind of you know, the kind of dividing line between who, you know, who really wants to do it and who has, you know, of course you have to have talent, but for example, as a writer, I thought it was very interesting what you said about how no matter how much you partied, okay, the next day you had a full writing day, okay? You were, you know, you were very disciplined that way, and I think that's another thing that me, first of all, as a student, and the students out there could draw from, could learn from, the
Well,
discipline.
I would not advise any young student to follow my party rules because I did party and I had a hell of a lot of fun. And that's my nature because, as I said, my mother was a party animal. And that was a wonderful side of her. That's, so to speak, the director side, the external side. I had plenty of internal side from my father, which was a lot of hours alone in the daytime, a lot of hours alone and a lot of hard work. But party, you must learn to laugh and have fun because there was so much rejection along the path, as you know from the book. You gotta find a way to lighten up and take it without getting too bitter or cynical.
And another thing that I think is interesting for the film students that are following is the fact that your first two films, and the first film that you made within the industry, The Hand, were both, I guess, what you could call genre films. They were, you know, one was a horror film, and at the moment in Italy, there's a big kind of transformation within the industry because the Italian industry, there used to be a sort of dividing line between the auteur filmmaker and the genre filmmaker, and I think looking at your career, it's very interesting that this line really isn't there. And because all of your films are auteur films, but you have worked within the genre milieu, and I think it's an important lesson. I think that film students here can learn.
Well, it's very ironic that the two films that I made that were horror films, The Hand and Seizure, are somewhat similar in theme, which is an artist basically thinks himself to death. Too much self-examination leads to this kind of destruction of the person. And one's a dream movie, the Seizure, it's amazing, and Hand is a paranoia movie. And they're both dark films, and for God's sake, they were stupid, I mean, of me to make them because they're dark and they're masochistic films, and I don't think that's the success of horror. I think horror, you have to be more of a sadist. I think you have to scare other people, not scare yourself. And I think that's what I did. I scared myself. They're both interesting films, no question, The Hand especially, but they're not broadly popular. When you go to a situation like A Midnight Express, which was my first popular hit, you have a victim, a person who's a heroic figure anyway, and he's victimized and in a Turkish jail, and you have many of the audience reactions that work on a broad scale. And I make I compare my thinking, wondering what's wrong with my thinking at one point. And then I talk about getting away from that thinking and then even going back to it with U-Turn, for example, which years later.
Well, I do think it was fascinating for me to realize in doing a little bit of prep for this that the screenplay for Natural Born Killers was written by Tarantino, and in a way that for me was another kind of twist in your career, which of course is not covered in the book. Okay. But you know, the connection there's just your career kind of covers, you know, there's so much there. It's sort of like a prism through which you can see, you know, film the evolution of sort of American cinema, essentially.
Yes, please bear in mind that Tarantino had story credit, not screenplay credit.
Okay,
because
story credit.
We significantly rewrote the
Okay.
screenplay we had, which we purchased from him, and that became the source of great contention. Our rewrite is significantly different than his tale, and you'd have to compare the two to tell. But for some reason, that factotum has gotten lost, and people think, no, it wasn't like that at all. We did a lot of work on the screenplay, and we made a very different movie than what he never saw it, I think, or he pretended not to. He didn't want to like it because he was quite enamored of himself and couldn't accept the idea that screenwriting sometimes can be passed on to other writers and shared or changed. That was contrary to his mentality at the time.
And that will go into the sequel, I hope, because that's
Sequel, no. There's no sequel to that movie, as far as I know.
The sequel of the book. The sequel of the book. We're anxiously waiting for the next chapters.
The sequel to the book. Yeah, I wish I could write one. I wish I could. I'm involved in a documentary now that's taking all my time, but I have to get there. I have to get back there and do it. It's just a tough shoot. It's a tough one to do. It's going to be, I don't want to make it too long a book, but my God, there's so much to cover.
Well, I'm sure, yeah, there is, absolutely. And to cover it with the meticulousness with which you covered the first installment. And I think really that is such an achievement of this book is just the detail, the memory, the way that your memory is so sharp, and there's so much there. And again, you know, for those who haven't read it, it is such a compelling and inspirational, honestly, book. And there's so many different layers to it. Yes, absolutely. I urge everybody who hasn't already read it to read it. The title in Italian is Cercare la luce, and it's La nave di Teseo. I think Tiziana wants to do a final closing remark. Okay.
Yes, I would like to thank you, Oliver, and I would like to thank you also all the students are connected with us in streaming, and thank you to be so many. And of course, Oliver, we would love to stay with you, you know, all the night to talk with you, because really I love your book, and really it was amazing, this conversation, very interesting. And also I will send you this special gift for Chasing a Light and for your book in Los Angeles. Thank you to be part of the festival, Filming Italy.
Thank you, Tiziana. I hope you have a good festival, and your students get a lot out of it in these next few days.
Yes.
Congratulations to putting it together.
Thank you so much. Allora, thank you. And, I hope to see you in person in LA very soon.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.
Okay.
Ciao. Grazie, Oliver.